November 1822. After 2 months at sea, a ship called the Honduras Packet finally reached the coast of Central America. The people on board had not come as tourists. They had come to begin new lives. Some had purchased land. Others had accepted jobs as doctors, soldiers, or government officials. Many had exchanged their British money for the currency of their new country. That country was called Poyais. According to the guidebook they had brought with them, the capital, St. Joseph, had government buildings, paved streets, banks, and comfortable homes. But when they looked toward the shore, they saw none of it, and a wall of dense tropical forest behind it. At first, they assumed there had been some kind of mistake, but before long, they understood the terrible truth. Apart from the ground beneath their feet, nothing they had been told about Poyais was real. So how did one man convince investors, bankers, and entire families to believe in a country that existed only on paper? He started with something real: his own reputation. Gregor MacGregor was not some unknown con man selling fantasies in a dark alley. He had served in the British Army. He had later fought in the Latin American Wars of Independence and risen to the rank of general. When he returned to Britain, he had a war hero's uniform, medals on his chest, and stories to tell. He knew influential people. He moved comfortably through wealthy and powerful circles. And most importantly, a small part of his story was true. In 1820, MacGregor had obtained rights to a vast tract of land on the Mosquito Coast from a local ruler. But the territory was remote, undeveloped, and extremely difficult to farm. On top of that real piece of land, MacGregor built a nation that existed only on paper. He called it Poyais. According to MacGregor, Poyais was not an empty stretch of tropical coastline. It was a stable, orderly nation waiting for British investment and new citizens. Its soil was extraordinarily fertile. Its rivers were filled with gold. Its climate was healthy and pleasant. Its forests were rich with valuable timber. And its capital, St. Joseph, was already becoming a modern European-style city. It was the perfect opportunity. Perhaps too perfect to be real. But MacGregor understood something important. A huge lie is difficult to believe. So instead of telling one enormous lie, he surrounded it with hundreds of small details. Poyais had a flag, a coat of arms, a constitution, military uniforms, government offices, land deeds, printed currency. It even had official offices in London, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. Investors could walk into a real building, speak to a real person claiming to be a government official, and leave with a document bearing the seal of the Poyaisian government. MacGregor also promoted a detailed guidebook published under the name Captain Thomas Strangeways. The book described the country's geography, wildlife, and economy. It told settlers which crops to grow. It advised them what supplies to bring. It described the capital, the government, and the life awaiting them in remarkable detail. The information in the book was fake, but the book itself was real, and that distinction mattered. Because MacGregor was not simply asking people to imagine a country, he was asking them to imagine their lives inside it. They could study its map. They could hold its money in their hands. They could read its laws. And Britain was already primed to believe in a place like Poyais. At the time, British investors were pouring money into newly independent Latin American nations. MacGregor simply placed Poyais among them. A respected London bank even helped sell bonds on behalf of the non-existent Poyaisian government. The imaginary country was now being traded in the same financial markets as real nations. MacGregor did not need people to believe in something completely new. He had simply given his fictional country the paperwork of a real one. But wealthy investors were only part of the plan. Poyais also needed citizens. And MacGregor and his agents offered ordinary families something far more powerful than interest on an investment: a second chance at life. Doctors, craftsmen, farmers, and bankers were told that Poyais needed them. Men with military experience were offered positions in the country's army. Families could buy land at prices that seemed unbelievably low compared with Britain. Some victims sold their homes and businesses. They bought tools and supplies. They accepted government appointments. One of them was a Scottish carpenter named James Hastie. He was not going to Poyais alone. His wife and 3 children were going with him. Hastie did not believe he was simply buying an investment. He believed he was buying a new life for his family. Before leaving, many of the settlers exchanged their British pounds for carefully printed Poyais dollars. The money in their pockets looked real, but it was worthless everywhere on Earth. On September 10, 1822, the Honduras packet left London carrying about 70 settlers. 2 months later, when they reached the Black River, they found no trace of the country they had been promised. Search parties went into the forest looking for St. Joseph. All they found were a few abandoned ruins. Even then, most of the settlers refused to believe that MacGregor had deceived them because the lie was simply too large to accept. They had seen the documents. They had spoken to government officials. They had read the book. They had crossed an ocean. There had to be some other explanation. Then the Honduras packet sailed away. The settlers were left alone on the shore with their supplies. The jungle surrounded them, and the nearest British settlement lay hundreds of miles away across punishing terrain. They built temporary shelters and waited for help. But instead of help, another ship arrived. In March of 1823, the Kennersley Castle brought a second and much larger group of settlers to the coast. They stepped ashore expecting to find a functioning colony. Instead, they found the first group struggling to stay alive. The newcomers had brought food and medicine. There were even 2 doctors among them. Then the rainy season began. Insects multiplied around the camp. Food began to rot. Malaria and yellow fever spread through the settlement. The people who had crossed the Atlantic to become landowners and government officials were now trapped in a collapsing camp beneath the rain. Only months earlier, James Hastie had arrived in Poyais with a family of 5. Now, he had buried 2 of his children. He would later write that everything seemed to have joined together for their destruction. When a passing ship happened to discover the settlement in May, several adults and children were already dead. Most of the survivors were gravely ill. The ship's crew told the settlers the truth. There was no functioning government of Poyais. There was no city called St. Joseph, and no official was coming to rescue them. The survivors were evacuated to Belize, but rescue did not end the disaster. Many were already too weak to recover. Disease continued to spread after they reached Belize. Others died during the voyage back to Britain. Of the roughly 250 people who sailed on the first 2 ships, at least 180 died. Fewer than 50 made it back to Britain. And the disaster could have been far worse. By the time news reached London, more ships were being prepared to carry additional settlers to Poyais. The Royal Navy stopped them before they could reach the coast. The fraud was no longer a suspicion. There were survivor accounts, worthless banknotes, land deeds, and government documents. Around 180 people were dead. At this point, you might expect MacGregor's story to end in a prison cell. It did not. MacGregor left Britain and began selling the same country all over again in France. When large numbers of people applied for passports to travel to a nation the French government did not recognize, officials became suspicious. The planned voyage was stopped. MacGregor was arrested. He was charged with fraud, but prosecutors could not present enough evidence to prove that MacGregor had been directly involved in the scheme. MacGregor blamed everything on his associates. In the end, he was acquitted. One of his associates was convicted. Around 180 people were dead. Yet Gregor MacGregor did not spend a single day in prison for their deaths, and he did not give up the fraud. Despite the deaths, the trial, and the public scandal, he continued selling smaller versions of the Poyais scheme for years. In 1838, he returned to Venezuela. There, he was welcomed not as a con man, but as a war hero. He was granted citizenship, he received a military pension, and he was treated with respect. When he died in 1845, he was buried in Caracas Cathedral with full military honors and government officials in attendance. The obituaries written about him made no mention of Poyais. Gregor MacGregor did not fool people with one enormous lie. He convinced them with hundreds of small details that looked real. Poyais existed only on paper, but the people who died believing in it were real.